All right. Good God. It seems like there's always something, right? Best laid plans. Anyways, so I'll get started here today. I have practice exams for us. That's why I had to run back to my office and then get back here. But today we're going to talk about externalities and property rights. And it's it's building a little bit on what we did last time, maybe in an unexpected way. And I'll get into that a little bit today. So we are up through chapter 13 here in the readings. And so basically for the exam, which is a week from today, right? Exactly like last time. Come here, take the exam, and then leave. Just kind of like the practice exam, same in content, similar in content and length. So today I'll hand out all that stuff. Next class we'll do the whole review where we just go over practice materials, and then we'll have our exam Tuesday the 28th. So you can see the material there. It's basically all the lectures since our last exam. That's everything that we've done, so it's not an inclusive exam. And of course we have a whole period reserved to next class for reviewing and getting ready for it and all that. So I won't say that much about it today, but do take your exam on the way out here. So you don't have to do the practice exam. But you will have to upload it onto Gradescope. I just reminded myself that when I get back to my office, I will put it onto Gradescope. So you can download the template there. And you can also, I'll put a PDF of this on both Top Hat and Gradescope so you can download it there. You do have to download it. It's best if you scan it using like an actual scanner so the format aligns correctly. So a Sunday noon, that would have to be tomorrow night, so I can have it done before class. So if you'll remember, I'm going to dive right in because I was a little delayed there with my usual IT stuff. If you'll remember, we talked about this diagram last time. This is kind of the summary picture of everything. And you can see here what we were talking about was this phenomenon called an externality, right? Whereas economic activity, in our case maybe market exchange, occurs, yet someone is impacted by this. Someone not part of the transaction is impacted. So the classic example is environmental damage, right? You buy agricultural products, beef, dairy, stuff like that. These are sold to you by farmers. In the process, maybe some contamination of water occurs, of stream water, runoff, stuff like that. And that reduces the enjoyment of boaters and people who use rivers for other things, clean water and all that stuff. So we saw that the way you could think about this in a supply and demand context is my red curve is demand, my green curve is supply, right? And at this normal market intersection of 105, we can do all the usual things we do in terms of analyzing a market, right? The only thing that's different is we now add in damages, right? A per unit damage, in this case, of $2, right? So this means that each unit that is produced of this good causes $2 in damage to some third party, right? And one way you can think about that is just by adding these damages as costs, right, into the supply curve, right, which is also capturing cost information, right? And we commonly say that this is private costs, supply, plus societal costs, right, this damages. That gives us this social supply curve, right, this social cost curve, really. And what we get out of this is that this intersection, we would like it to be not at this 105 point, but at this 86 point, right? A quantity of 80 and a price of 6. So we see that there's too much of the good produced. Put another way, the price is too low in the market, right? And okay, so that's a very brief synopsis of everything that we did last time. The last thing is that we have an automatic, it almost recommends just looking at the diagram, a corrective, which is a tax, right? If we just put a tax on the good, right, and we try to calibrate that to the damages that are being caused, we can get our private market, right, our competitive market to behave in a socially desirable way, right? That is to say, we can get the socially best outcome to coincide with what will happen in the market with this tax. Quickly, a couple things that are interesting about this. One of which is that it reduces the usual calculus that we do, right, which suggests that interfering in a market always reduces societal welfare, right? Here we can have a tax that increases societal welfare. Oh yeah, and we didn't even mention that it also generates a little money for us, right? This is kind of what happens with this congestion pricing scenario. Interestingly, and maybe especially relevant for today's lecture, you can also think about it as a situation where the producer of the good is using up a resource and not paying for it, right? In the example I gave earlier, farmers would be using up river water, right? Clean river water, and they're not paying for it. So just as a matter of economics, you want your production decisions to reflect the true costs of things. So that's kind of what we're doing with the tax, right? We're making someone pay for a resource that they were using for free. So it kind of, there's a bunch of loops that sort of close when you think about it this way. The other thing you might imagine is that this is, once you start thinking about the world this way, it's hard to see, almost everywhere you look, there's these so-called externalities, right? Whenever you buy something, it seems like there's a chance a third party's impacted, right? All of the industrial products you buy, certainly things like gasoline, anything that impacts the environment. So in that sense, it seems like we've gone pretty far to kind of, before when I told you taxes, bad. Now you might say, well, we need a lot of taxes. Interestingly, I talked about all of this last time, where we arrive at this idea that we need taxes to kind of fix all of these societal problems. Of course, there are other alternatives, other ways to fix these problems. I mentioned here command and control policies, right? One thing we might do is, instead of putting a tax in place, is we might just do other things that tell the firm that it has to reduce its production from 100 to 80, or tell the firms, right? Restrictions on production, stuff like that. And thinking about the history of economic thought here, something I like to do, this is roughly where the discipline of economics was in the 1930s, right? Pigou had written this giant treatise on externality problems, and the supposition was that taxes were needed as correctives for all of these problems, right? Of course, in some sense, this is what a policy wonk would very much excite a policy wonk, right? Because now you have to do a deep dive into everything. You have to start to figure out all of these quantities. What is the tax? What is the damage? How do we tune all of these markets to control these externalities, right? It takes a lot of information. Yes? You need to know a lot. And of course, we have some great classes that actually teach you how to do this. Environmental economics, for example. Law and economics, we talk a little bit about that. So after some very careful deliberation, Ronald Coase, an economist who won the Nobel Prize for what we're about to talk about, argued that in fact this was a very simplistic view of the externality problem, right? That there were damages that needed to be taxed, if you want to think about it that way. He said what the problem really is a problem of missing property rights. Right? The problem is, someone's using a resource and they're not paying for it. Why are they not paying for it? Well, because we haven't described what the ownership rights of this resource are. Who has the right to use it and who doesn't, right? And so Coase said, you know what? If you set up the rights so that, if you set up rights fully, you define them, and then you let the market do its magic, right? You allow people to buy and sell the rights, then you can sidestep all of this, right? And this insight has turned out to be, some of my colleagues love this insight. Some of them think of it as mundane, and they're like, oh, big deal. I'm not particularly impressed. I thought we would look at this original paper a bit. It was in the Journal of Law and Economics. It's called The Problem of Social Cost, right? It's something we've talked about. And you can see how he starts it out here. The paper is concerned with those actions of business firms which have harmful effects on others. The standard example is that of a factory that the smoke from which has harmful effects on those occupying neighboring properties. That's a pretty standard description of what I've been talking about, right? And then he even mentions PIGU, right? The economics of welfare, which is all about that stuff. So you can even see he's summarizing a lot of what I just said to you. The conclusions to which this kind of analysis seems to have led is that it would be desirable to make the owner of the factory liable for the damage caused to those injured by the smoke, right? Or to place a tax, right? So he talks about all of this, all of these things here, as we've kind of discussed here. Anyways, let's dive right in here. Section 2. The traditional approach has tended to obscure the nature of the choice that has to be made. We usually think about it as A inflicting harm on B, and how do we restrain A, right? But we are dealing with the problem of reciprocal nature. He even says, but this is wrong, right? We are dealing with the problem of a reciprocal nature. To avoid the harm to B would inflict harm on A. The real question that has to be decided is, should A be allowed to harm B, or should B be allowed to harm A? Interesting. And if you'll notice what he does is, having his background in law, he looks at our famous Sturgis v. Bridgman suit to avoid, he talks about the confectioner and the doctor that we mentioned last time, the noise of the confectioner harming the doctor's practice. Well, you could shut down the confectioner, right? That clearly harms the confectioner. That solves the problem. Or the confectioner could continue to operate and harm the doctor. Which way do we want this to go? Now, he gives an example, and I'm gonna go a little bit crazy here in a second. But he has a really interesting example here that he talks about throughout, and we're going to work through my version of this. He said he's going to start an analysis by examining a case where the damaging business has to cause damages, right, to the afflicted. And he says a good example of the problem under discussion is afforded by the case of straying cattle, which destroy crops growing on neighboring land, right? So you have a farmer and a rancher. And the question is, right, how do we want to restrain the farmer's activity? By the way, I'm going to use an even simpler example than his. He has this neat example where he just uses this is the only technical discussion in the article, so you can follow my link and read it. I mean, that's one of the geniuses of the article, is it's so obvious and so plain the way he lays everything out that it works. But I guess we can go back to my notes now. It's interesting that he picks a farmer and a rancher. He says a good example. That's an understatement, right? That's the best example there is. So if you think about it, not only does this resonate, you think about American history, that's, the whole movement west is about farmers and ranchers. When I was a kid, I used to watch Westerns all the time, and every Western had some variation on, maybe those themes. I actually, over last summer, I read a book on the Crusades, right? And the book was sort of arguing that, well, this conflict, the Crusades, this, was many centuries, was really about farmers and ranchers, right? It was about sedentary people, trying to sort of take over the Middle East area, and, coming into conflict with people who had been nomadic, right? That was a big aspect of it. And of course, there's the original property rights conflict, which went kind of badly. And this is the story in Genesis, right? If you go back to the Old Testament, or I guess this story is foundational in all three Abrahamic religions, right? And you probably know it. You can read it here if you like. But essentially what happens is Cain, there's Cain and Abel, they're brothers, right? Cain is the older brother. Yes? Yeah. Abel's the younger brother. Cain is a farmer, right? Abel is a shepherd, but a rancher, effectively, right? And there's all kinds of stuff encoded in that. And that's one of the things, Coase says a good example. What he's really trying to say is that all of these conflicts come with all sorts of baggage, right? There's issues of who is entitled to what, who's breaching which customs. All of these things sort of come to the head in most of these conflicts. And you can think about those three historical examples I gave you, and this, I guess this is the, I forget what you call it, but there's a word for the original, or this part of the Bible anyway. But anyway, so Cain and Abel are like this too, right? Not only do they have conflicting uses, but they have the situation where Cain is older. That's why he's the farmer, primogeniture, right? He inherited the land. Maybe he feels a little entitled. And then things go better for Abel than for Cain. I mean, that's one way to read this. And so what does Cain do? Well, he resolves this dispute anyways by killing his brother, right? And that causes problems for the rest of human history as the story goes, right? So there's all these interesting things that sort of come into this, right? These disputes. And I think Coase is trying to say this to us, right? He's trying to say to us that I know these disputes are intractable. And it's not just as simple as slapping a tax on things. Okay, so moving on. So let's look at this statement as economists. By the way, I love to bring this in because that, the difficulty of, or that little story kind of echoes to you how an economist thinks about things. It's like, well, okay, it's great. Everybody has their causes and difficulties. Let's boil it down into a simple example and just start thinking through the costs and benefits and see where that takes us. So it's kind of a chance where I can do that once again for you. So I've made a minimal example here, and there's 3 numbers involved, and each serves a purpose here, because we really have 2 questions that we want to answer. And this becomes very important for talking about, someone mentioned, last time somebody asked me about tradable permits and environmental policy. This will become important for that down the road. So we have this situation where, I'll call it damages are equal to 100, right? So to take up Coase's example, the rancher has cows that are running wild and they're destroying the farmer's crops to the tune of $100, right? And we'll say, it could be per day or per season or whatever, but we'll just leave it at we'll forget about time here. Now, we can prevent the damages, right? And there's multiple ways, I will say, to prevent the damages. Right, so if the rancher stops damages, you might say the rancher builds a corral or a corralling system, right? And when he does that, the costs are $80, right? So this is the cost of the rancher from stopping the damage. The farmer could also stop the damages, right? Now for the farmer, it's a little bit cheaper. You can think about maybe why this is the case. Maybe he just has to fence in a particular area with barbed wire and that does the trick. That's a little easier than what the rancher would have to do. But it's a little cheaper for the farmer to stop the damages than it is for the rancher. So why did I set up this example like this, and what is it getting at? Well, we really want to answer 2 questions here, right? One of which is, should we stop the damages, right? We've seen that in one implication of our externality theory is that we don't just want to, reduce every activity that damages things to 0, right? So you might think about this as a version of that. Do we want to stop the damages? And maybe I could answer the question for you. An economist would say yes, because the costs of preventing the damages, however we do it, right, are less than the damages themselves. Right? So think about it this way, and this is a very Coasean economic way of thinking about it. You can say, we're going to incur damages somehow. They're either going to be damages to crops, which have this value, or it's going to be damages to our wallets, which is going to be this, right? So we can either pay 60 or 100, or 80 or 100, but in any case we should, right, prevent the damages. So that's one thing I'm trying to show with this. Yes, we want to control the herd, right? It's economically, I guess you could say, beneficial to control the herd. Well, the second thing we want to do is answer this question, how we should stop the damages, right? And of course, as economists, we would say the cheapest possible way to do this, right, is for the farmer to stop the damages, right? So we just say that as a matter of economics, right, we want to stop those damages and the farmer should build the fence around his property. That's the best case scenario, right? Now, you might be saying, all right, well, that's, okay, I don't know if that's, is it fair? Maybe, right? You might say that, if we were sort of thinking about this as a matter of law, as we will in a second, we're not really saying anything about that yet. We're just sort of thinking about the economics. We want the farmer to build a fence, and we want to stop these damages of 100, right? So we know that. Now we have to go to policy, right? Now, the old way to do policy here, right, would be, well, a couple of things. One thing we could do is we could just say, farmer, you're on your own. Sorry about that. And the farmer would say, come on, man, this rancher's tramping all over my crops, and now you're telling me it's my problem? And we'd say, well, that's how the numbers worked out. Sorry. We could do that, right? But we could also couple that with a rule like, well, rancher, you're going to have to pay damages, right, to the farmer if you damage crops. And if we did something like that, well, then the rancher we might wind up with a solution that's still better than nothing, right, but not exactly what we wanted. So if we somehow mess this up and we say, well, the farmer, it just seems unfair that he's incurring damages and now we're making him responsible for controlling these damages. Well, so maybe we'll say, rancher, you're going to have to do something to constrain your herd, and the rancher would then choose $80, right, and stop paying $100 in damages, right? I don't want to be liable, so I'll have to control the activity, right? So that might be how we made a legal decision here. We could either side with the farmer and the rancher has to control, or we could side with the rancher and then the farmer has to build a fence. Either way, we get the damages stopped, but we're not ensured that we're going to do the absolute best way of stopping the damages. I guess that's my circuitous way of making the point. Okay. So, we run the risk, I guess, of doing something inefficient, right? Particularly if we make the rancher pay. Now, Coase says, no, that's all wrong. He says, you're thinking about this wrong, and if we think about this from a property rights perspective, right, that is to say, we think about this as a problem of defining rights over this thing, right? You could say trampling rights. Maybe we'll call that's what it is, right? So there's this thing called the right to let cows run free, and we just have to describe whether or not the rancher has it, right? Is it his right to let the cows run free, or is it the farmer, right? In that case, I guess it would be a right to not have cows running free, right? But in either case, that's really what we're doing, and then we can think about our options as protecting the property rights of one or the other, right? Rights over this. I mean, property, we probably don't need that word here. We could just say rights. Who possesses the free range? Now, that's what we have to do, Coase says. Part one. Part two. Once someone owns the free range, we'll say, well, we should also allow them to bargain and sell this right, right? They should be able to bargain over the free range rights and to sell it, right? So let's think about it this way. Ultimately, we'll wind up at these, there's my numbers again. What Coase then says has now been elevated to the status of a theorem, right? We call it the Coase theorem. And it says if property rights are well defined, right? We define the ranching rights, and bargaining costs are low, externalities, these external costs that we've been talking about, will be resolved in a socially optimal way. That is to say, if we define who has the right to do something and then just get out of the way, automatically the best possible thing will happen for society. Right? That is to say, the damages will be controlled and it'll turn out to be the farmer building the fence. Every case, right? How does this work? Okay, well, let's think about it this way. Let's suppose let's take the difficult case first. Let's suppose we've done what is fair, I guess, or what seems to be the right thing to do, which would be to prevent the damage for the rancher, right, to going to the rancher, prevent the rancher from trampling, right? So we give the free range rights to the farmer, yep? Now, that's tough news for the rancher. If there's trampling, right, he's going to have to pay $100 in damages to the farmer, right? That's what it means to have the right. You have to be compensated if you're impacted. The rancher might then say to himself, oh, this sucks. I have to build a corral. It's going to cost me $80. But maybe then he gets an idea. He says, what if instead I buy the right to trample off the farmer, right? And then just let my cows run free. Got it? And he goes over to the farmer and he says, wait a minute. He says, you know what? They said I have to build a corral. How about I just buy that right off of you to trample? And the farmer says, what are you, nuts? And the rancher says, well, hear me out here. What if I give you $70? This is high-tech diagram here, to the farmer, right? $70. Why did I pick $70? Does anybody tell me? Yes?
It's between basically what the farmer would have to pay and the rancher, the minimum the rancher would have to pay.
Got it, right, that's exactly right. So the farmer, the rancher says, give me those property rights, right? I'll give you $70. And the farmer says, interesting. That's not so bad, right? Because what's going to happen here? You give me $70, right? I build the fence for $60 because I want to stop the damages to myself, right? And now I have $10 more than I did otherwise. Yes? So in effect, the rancher has paid the farmer to build the fence. But really, the economist would say what's happened is he's purchased the property right and now made it the farmer's responsibility. Yes? Now, the interesting thing here is this benefits not only the farmer, right? 70 is greater than 60, but the rancher benefits too, because 70 is less than 80, right? So buying the property right, even though even though the rancher seems like the one who should stop the damages, buying the property right actually benefits both of them in such a way so that, and also from society's perspective, we see that now the damages are controlled as we wanted in the cheapest possible way, which we also wanted. Yes?
Wouldn't a better option be for the rancher just to reimburse the farmer for the fence? Just give him the 60, like the 60 right out. That way his
Okay, that's possible. I picked 70 here because it was just right in between the two. But that's kind of then you could say, well, the farmer would say, well, $60, okay, but how about 62 or 78, right? By the way, this is a big thing if you take a micro class, or law and economics or something. Bargains like this, where there's surplus to be had, you can really pick any number between the two. So that's a good point. But that is also a point I'm going to stress, right? This is, if you go back to day one of class when I started talking about textbooks, right, being sold from people who had taken the class to people who haven't, it's kind of the same idea, right? These costs of preventing something become values in some sense, and trading the property right becomes just trading a good. And it moves from lower values to higher values, right? So you might say the rancher values the right more because it's costlier for the rancher to stop the damage. Of course, the other case is easy. What if we just gave the rancher the right to trample, right? Well, then the farmer has to build the fence anyways, right? So the interesting thing there is, it's important that I say that. The interesting thing there is that it doesn't matter who we gave the right to, right? If we gave it to the rancher, well, then the farmer builds the fence. If we gave it to the farmer, the rancher purchases the right and the farmer builds the fence. The important thing about this is that we've put the right in place, which is kind of an interesting, it's an interesting outcome and kind of a deep outcome here. So, of course, there are some things that I should say about this. One of which is that this doesn't, it's not neutral from their perspective. From the social perspective, we're like, okay, if we define rights, we know the best thing will happen. From their perspective, they say, well, I would definitely prefer to have the right if I'm the rancher, right? That doesn't cost me any money. So that's kind of an interesting thing that you should, I mean, there's a lot of economists who ponder this all the time. I'm one of them, and how this works. So you should think a lot about this, right, and what you make of this. Okay. So this has led to in part, this paper has led to this enormous literature on property rights and bargaining, and even some applied literature, which we're going to talk about. The fundamental insight of Coase here underlies a lot of the modern environmental policies that we pursue. And I think I hinted last time that, if you think about things as rights definition, you think about a lot of problems this way, you can get pretty far. And maybe if I have time, I'll circle back to that. I don't even know how I'm doing on time here. Oh, I'm doing pretty good. Okay, so we'll have a little fun with this, but I'm going to do it in a particular way. One of the things that people have observed, Elinor Ostrom, a famous economist who won the Nobel Prize also, observed that a lot of times when people, across the world, all different cultures at all different times and places, find themselves in these situations, right? These conflicting use situations. Oftentimes they develop neat little institutions that solve these problems, right? Which in some sense embody the logic of the Coase theorem, right? That is to say, they involve delineating rights in some way, and then payment of compensation, but also, maybe some other aspects as well. I might be oversimplifying it. But the point is, and this is something that I've been thinking about my entire career, is that property rights are a complex object, and the compensation is also that goes along with this is complex as well. So there's actually one, they'll tell you the backstory here. We're going to watch a little My Little Pony. This was back when my kids were, I know it's getting old at this point. And how many people have watched My Little Pony before? Oh, okay, great. So this was back when I had kids who were, small, and I was sitting on the couch and they would be doing whatever. And my daughter was just kind of cranking through some My Little Pony. And I was doing something, reading, I don't know what I was doing. But as this episode was unfolding, I was like, what is going on here? And so I started watching it, and I was thinking, whoever did this episode has been thinking a lot about the Coase theorem. And so in the end, I was thinking, this is a really nice illustration of a lot of the causes that I've been talking about, right? This idea that property rights disputes are complex. It's hard to make, it's hard to sort of say that one person's moral position overrides another's. And then in the end, there's a solution, which they just, they solve the problem in a very Ostromian way, if that's a word. And then they just bungle the end. So I'll tell you what I mean here in a second. But let's look at the episode. I'll give you a little setup here. Oh, that's not it. I need to go to the other browser, right? Yeah. Oh, there we go. Let's hope it's still there. Okay, it's still there. So here's what's happening. The gang is going out west to visit one of their relatives who have founded a new village, right? It might be called Appaloosa, where they have all these apple trees they're planting. It's like a nice western village. And along the way, there's a train accident. So let me see if I can kind of, I think I said it was, what was my first point where we were watching? I'll look at my notes here quickly. You know what? This is what I'll do. Give me 1 second. (6:33), 10:30, 14:30. (18:22). Okay, so those are my timestamps. And we'll go through. So they along the way to this town of Appaloosa, they run into a stampede of buffalo, and it causes one of their party to fall off the train here. Maybe I'll show you a little bit of the stampede here. I guess it's not. I'm getting.
Something tells me this isn't a circus act.
Let's see if we get it from the beginning.
And that's when the yellow bird thought to himself, my favorite little tree isn't such a little tree anymore. So she sang her song.
I guess they're detecting us now, huh? So it's not going to work.
I thought you had it on the YouTube, though. Why did it back to Netflix?
Let me try it on the. I don't know.
Is hardware acceleration off?
I don't know. Peter was telling me that it's because of it happens all the time. Let me just try it here quickly. If I can't get it, I'll just have to.
Turning off hardware acceleration in your browser is typically really good for like getting on DRM.
Let me. Do you know how to do that? I don't know how to.
Yeah, go to your browser settings.
Where's that? Let me just try this first.
You can't disable it on Safari.
To have difficulty seeing, even with glasses. Sure.
Is that loud enough for you?
Big screens and 24/7 help. Or get our affordable plans.
There we go. Okay. So there's the train coming into town here. Let me see if my timestamps are about right. Here comes the herd of buffalo, so maybe I'll show you what happens here. Might be a little slow here.
They're getting awfully close to the train.
Anyway, so what happens is the party gets separated because of this, right? And someone winds up with the buffalo herd, and the rest of the group proceed to the town of Appaloosa, right? And here's where we kind of learn what's going on here when they arrive.
Hey there! Welcome to Appaloosa!
Braver, listen.
Hey, cousin Applejack, mind your manners. You have yet to introduce me to your compadres. Shame on you.
Braver, listen. Something terrible's happened.
Terrible is right. Your train's a full 7 minutes late. That's 7 minutes less for you to delight in the pleasures and wonders of Appaloosa. Bottles of mine, we separate when we built all this in just the past year, don't it? And as you can see, we have all the finest comforts, like horse-drawn carriages.
Okay, you vote. Just switch.
And those there are horse-drawn carriages.
Listen, Braver,
And here's our local watering hole, the salt block. That's what I'm sold for you.
Have I get a glass of water?
Oh, there's the office of Sheriff Silverstock. And here's where we have our Wild West dances. And here's where we have our Wild West dances.
But Braver, we
And here's the most wonderful sight in all of
Here we go.
Appaloosa, our apple orchard.
Braver!
First harvest should be any day now.
Braver!
Good thing, too.
Braver!
We need that grub to live on.
Braver!
Yes, cuz?
You have a very nice town and all, but we have a huge problem. Some of our friends are missing.
A stampede of buffalo.
We lost accident.
We can't find Pinkie Pie.
And we had an apple tree with us for your orchard, but they took that too.
Say, Buffalo? Them Buffalo, they want to send their opponents to take every single tree here off this land. They sure as heck don't want any new ones added in.
But why?
Beats me. We put a lot of hard work into this land so we could feed our town, our pets, our foes. And now they're saying all these trees have to go? It ain't fair.
So are you seeing how this becomes a ranching and farming problem? So there's conflicting use here in the valley where Appaloosa is and where the orchard is. So what happens here? Well, let's move forward to 1030 and see what happens here.
Wait! Please, my apologies for what happened on the train. For anyone to be hurt. Yeah, right. We only wanted the tree. The settler ponies have overtaken the land and have planted an orchard all over it. Because of their thoughtlessness, we can no longer run over our traditional stampeding grounds. Huh?
I think it's time they met Chief Thunderhooves.
We have a long and wide and beating trail that we have broken for many generations. My father stampeded upon these grounds, and his father before him, and his father before him, and his father before him, and his father before him.
So you get the idea here, and one reason why I like this particular take on the conflicting use is because here, typically you might say, well, it's a problem of ranchers damaging farmers' crops. Well, here, it's actually kind of more nuanced, right? Because the ranchers have been in the valley for, apparently a very long time before there were any farmers. So what gives the right for the farmers to just come in and plant a bunch of trees, right? It's kind of what you would call in economics or law, coming to the nuisance, right? They knew that someone was doing this, and yet they still wound up in the valley. Let's go forward to 1430 here and see what happens here. How does the gang propose to solve this problem or help out, right? That's kind of what happens in cartoons. The gang solves the problem. Well,
It's the right thing to do, you gotta share.
so they decide to put on a musical, right? This is, and it involves, just kind of some songs. Sharing is caring here, so I'll let it play a little bit. And this is their approach to solving the problem.
You gotta care, and there'll always be a way through. Both our diets, I should mention, are completely vegetarian. We all eat hay and oats, while we at each other's throat. You gotta share, you gotta care. It's the right thing to do, and there'll always be a way through.
Sorry. I apologize for this.
That was fantastic! What a great song! You're right on!
Did it solve the problem?
It appears that Sheriff Silverstar and I have come to an agreement.
We have.
That was the word, Epicene. The time for action is upon us. Our stampede will start at high noon tomorrow, and if the orchard is still there, we'll it and the whole town.
But Chief!
And we Appaloosans say you better rip fast, because we'll be ready and wait. But Sheriff!
That wasn't the message of my song at all.
Okay, so we'll see what happens here in a moment. But you can see here that what the gang was really trying to do was solve this problem with a little empathy, right? By emotional appeal. And, that didn't work out so well. And this is kind of getting to the idea that a lot of these disputes seem intractable, right, between farmers and ranchers, if you want to think about it that way. So what happens when high noon comes along the next day? I'm sorry about the skipping. You'll have to watch it on your own.
right thing to do. You gotta share.
Ready? Aim!
Okay, just to... The chief takes a pie to the face and goes down.
Hey, I've got a much better idea. We will allow the apple orchard to for a share of its fruit. Most delicious apple pies.
The rotary turquoise any day of the week.
Bloomberg, this is your special day. Mama's so proud of you. Dear Princess Celestia, friendship is a wondrous and powerful thing. Even the worst of enemies can become friends. You need understanding and compromise. You've got to share. You've got to care.
Okay, so you see what happened there? Did sharing and caring solve the problem? No, it was the chief's idea to negotiate out the correct property rights with the little compensation. Not sharing and caring, right? I would have preferred if they ended it with that, that would have been a better message, I think, for my daughter, rather than none of the sharing and caring stuff, right? But it's kind of an interesting, I like that example for a lot of reasons. For one, of course, the Ostromian solution to the problem is kind of a neat take on things, but it's also a really neat illustration as to how these problems can be very morally ambiguous, and what is fair is not immediately obvious. But oftentimes people can sort of think about the property rights and the compensation and solve the problem. So maybe I've convinced you of that, or I've convinced you that I'm crazy, right? One or the other. Anyways, so moving on. It's season 1, episode 21, if you want to watch on your own. This logic, as I mentioned, has become an important sort of staple in a lot of branches of economics, and in particular, in this the new, I guess you could say, the modern approach, I'll say, to controlling problems of externalities or pollution, right, environmental damage. So you can think about this in a couple of ways here, and one of which is to think about some of the stuff that I was talking about with the rancher, when the rancher has to sort of do this calculus when they're made liable for damages they cause. You sort of face two decisions, or you sort of face a decision, right, in these circumstances. You can either pay the damages, right, or you can damage your wallet, right, by paying for stopping the activity. And that's sort of an important part of this, in that people respond to the incentives that you create when you give them this obligation. So think about it this way. This is true in general. If you suppose, rather than just damages, you might say that when you impose a punishment on a firm, you're basically saying, if you engage in this activity, you have to pay F, a fine, right? Or you could stop the activity at cost to yourself of C. So I was thinking about some great examples of this. And one great example is, in New York City, we have these delivery trucks, the FedEx, USPS, UPS, all over the city, right? Now, do they park illegally? Has anybody ever seen an illegally parked delivery truck? Everybody, yeah, you're not even going to raise your hands. Well, do they get fined for this? Yes. They get tickets all the time, loads of them, right? But why do they do this? Well, they say, well, we could avoid, we could circle the block or something, or look for parking or whatever, but it's faster and more efficient, more cost-effective for us to just pay the fines, right? Engage in the activity and pay the fines. And that's what they do. So if you're interested, that is a cost of doing business. It turns out that I think every year what they wind up doing is FedEx says, all right, New York City, we have $100 million in tickets here. We'll write you a check for $60 million. We'll settle this rather than sort of contesting them and all. And so they negotiate a settlement there. And so this is what happens with these big carriers. Yes?
Also, another way to look at it is if they spend more time looking for parking, that's more time it takes for your delivery to get shipped, and then consumerism goes down in terms of that.
Yeah, so I might say C for them is greater than F, right? The costs of doing something else, as you're saying, are greater than the fine. So they just pay the fine. It's a cost of doing business, right? And they're minimizing that cost. Yeah.
Also, for certain instances, they get a tax imposed upon them with a commercial license, because that allows them to park too.
Oh, okay. Well, there's nuances. Yeah, we don't hash out parking policy. I'm just, the basic point I'm trying to make here is that they do this. And this is, by the way, what all these environmental firms do as well. You can prevent your environment, you can prevent your damages, or you can pay the fine. So this is really the logic behind these marketable permits systems. So what is going on here in a marketable permit system? If you want to think about what a marketable permit is, it's a tool of environmental policy where you buy the right to pollute, right? So if you're a firm, you can be shut down or penalized severely if you pollute the environment, unless you have a permit to issue a little bit of smog into the air or a little, pollution into the river, right? So if you have this permit, then you can engage in the activity. Now, you might say, how is this related to Coase? And I would say, well, what we're doing is selling a property right? Something like the right to the free range or the right to park illegally. We're selling that right. Now, I have a little example here that shows you why we like this as economists. And it kind of goes as follows here. And we even, one of the important aspects of a lot of this theory is actually auction theory kind of blends nicely into this. So if you're interested in that, we have classes where we talk about auctions and how they work. But what I have here, I have 5 firms. I've creatively named them A, B, or 6 firms, C, D, E, F. And I have these things that I've called the cost of abatement. So what are costs of abatement? That's how costly it is for you to stop doing the activity, right? So you can imagine each firm is smogging up the air a little bit. How easy is it for a firm to stop smogging the air? And you can imagine that costs are different across firms, if only because some are, if you're thinking about steel or something like that, some firms are a lot older and they're less, naturally able to stop the pollution. Some are newer maybe. And the costs I have here are A is 1, B is 5, C is 4, D is 8, E is 3, and F is 7, right? So those are the costs here. And then what we would want to do, one thing we could do is we could throw a tax out there, right? We might say, all right, we've done our research on these firms and their costs, and so let's suppose we want to reduce pollution, right? To cut it in half. So that would mean 3 of these 6 firms have to stop the activity, right? Put another way, 3 of the firms engage in the activity, right? So you think about the opposite of polluting, it's abatement. Well, when you make a decision about how much abatement there is, you also make a decision about how much pollution. So an economist would say, all right, well, let's see here. what we would like to do is, if we want to get 3 units of abatement, I'll show you how this works. What we could do is set I'm going to look at my numbers here, 1, 3, 4, is set a tax or a fine, right, of 4.5. So this is something that the engineering economist would do. You look at the costs of all the firms, right, and then I set a fine of 4.5. How did Baker come up with this number? Well, think about the calculus on my previous slide here, or the calculations that I was doing. If the fine is 4.5, right, firm 1 is going to look at that fine and say, well, we can stop our pollution for $1, right? So we'll stop the pollution. 1 is cheaper than 4.5. Firm 2 is going to say, a fine of 4.5, I'm just going to pay the fine because $5 is too much, right? Firm C is going to say, we'll stop, 4 is less than 4.5, right? Firm D is going to say, we'll pay the fine. We'll keep polluting and pay. We'll stop, pay. So you'll notice I picked this number so that A, C, and E are the firms that stop their behavior. We arrive with 3 units of abatement and also 3 units of pollution, right? And you'll notice that, akin to my farmer-rancher example, we wind up with the abatement occurring at the lowest possible social cost, right? That is to say, the 3 best or most efficient abaters of pollution wind up doing the activity. So that's a marvelous economic solution right there, right? I know I'm going a little fast through that, but I am kind of getting a little short on time here. Let me look. Oh, I'm doing okay. Okay. So, but hopefully you can kind of appreciate how that works here. But you might also be able to appreciate that with my finely tuned economics eye, I was able to sort of look at my numbers and pick the right fine. In reality, that's not so easy. You'd have to know what all the costs are like and how much it costs each firm to stop things and all that stuff, right? To engage or not in the activity. So maybe we don't want that property, and so maybe we want to do something else. So let's try a Coasean property rights solution, and let's say we're going to sell some rights. We're going to sell 3 permits to pollute. Because we want to get 3 units of abatement, we're going to sell off 3 permits to pollute. So we're going to auction those off or do whatever, and we'll just let the price be what it will. And we can then ask, okay, well, who's going to wind up buying the permits? Well, which firm would pay the most for a permit if they were submitting bids? If I was bidding, if we had all these firms bidding for permit number 1, right? Well, you might think that firm D would pay the most for a permit, right? Why is that the case? Because it's extremely costly for this firm to stop its pollution. It says whatever the price of a permit is, if 8 is greater than P, we'll buy a permit. Firm A, by contrast, won't pay that much, right? They don't really need a permit. They'll just say, well, if it's anything more than $1, we won't buy it. So you might be able to convince yourself that our best bidders for these pollution permits, well, D, F, and B are the firms that will buy the permits. Yes? And, well, what will the price of a permit ultimately be? Something pretty close to 4.5, right? So it's almost the exact same solution that we got by slapping the tax in there. But what have we had to know about the firm's costs? Nothing, right? We didn't have to go think about what their costs were at all. We just say, we want to get 3 units of abatement, we'll sell the right to abate, or sell the right to pollute, and then the efficient firms will wind up abating, and the costly abaters will wind up buying permits. Because we established this right. Yes?
Since the permit is determined by the government, that's
The amount of permits?
The amount of permits.
Yeah.
In terms of the government dishing it out, why would it average out? Couldn't like the government, if they wanted to like stop all pollution
Yep.
or force their hand, make the price of the permit costly enough that it would have that they would all have to get permits or they have to obey?
Interesting. Okay, yes. So there's a couple ways to do that, and in fact, many of the objectives that the government has pursued using these things are permits that expire, right? So it's kind of like, so the question was just about some of the mechanics. If you didn't hear it, it was about, well, how does the government set the price of the permits and all of that stuff? Typically, the government doesn't, it's an auction and it lets the price fluctuate, right? So the price can find the 4.5, right? But oftentimes what the objective is to completely cease the activity. So the saleable rights, I don't have an example here. Oh, yeah, down here I do. So two of the giant successes that occurred here in exactly this way, I think you should read about these if this interests you. So there was leaded gasoline, like a lot of companies would put lead in the gasoline. It was just like this refining thing. It made it burn better. I don't know. But what they did was they used this system of permits where they would gradually expire over time, and they tuned the permits down to 0 eventually, right? So in year 10 or something, there were 0 permits issued. And in that way, they completely phased out the activity. And like I say, I mean, as a teenager, I was clueless about a lot of things, but this happened throughout my teenage years, and I didn't even really notice until one day I was like, what happened to the lead in the gasoline? It's gone. And it was a big success. The other thing was acid rain policy worked in this way as well, right? It was another permittable, another permit situation where that used to be a big environmental problem back in the 70s and 80s, and it was caused a lot in part by sulfur dioxide used in manufacturing. Well, they did kind of the same thing. They were like, you're going to have to buy permits, they'll expire, and we'll gradually tune down the activity of these firms to get it to work here. Now, one interesting thing that happens, like any, this is an interesting article here, oftentimes policies have unintended consequences, and it so happens that, most of the time those are negative things, but for a lot of these policies, it turns out they have what economists think of as positive consequences. So one thing that occurred, an example back there, I have a great example pursuant to your question, was if you're an environmental organization, there's nothing to stop you from buying a permit, right? What do you do with it? Nothing. You buy it and put it in a drawer, and that's a unit of pollution pulled out of circulation, right? So for example, if you wanted to pay 4.5 or 5.5 for a permit, you could bid, and you could push the price of permits up, buy a permit, and then that would make this firm abate, right? And so in that way, your objectives now have a way of manifesting themselves in the market. So I was thinking about this, I grew up in kind of a rural area of New England, and at one point, I was reading, it was like just part of the surrounding region. There was this, there's a lot, I have all kinds of stuff I'll talk about later, but my area gradually gentrified, right? It became less rural and more sort of, people moving into the suburbs and all that. So it was kind of this collision between affluence and kind of backwoods folks. But one of the things that happened was every year they would, in a certain part of the area there, a surrounding town, I'll say, they would have this auction where you could buy trapping permits, right? Like for beavers and stuff like that. Yeah, exactly. Like I see people making faces. Trapping is pretty tough on the animals, right? It's not a, it's not a particularly, nice way to exit the world, I guess. If you're trapped in, some of them are underwater, so animals die by drowning. Long story short, people don't like this, so what would happen is if you were kind of wildlife, pro-animal, you would buy the permits. And in fact, this article, I've never been able to find it, but it was about how people bought up all the trapping permits, right? So there was essentially no trapping anymore in the area. And that's kind of what you were talking about, right? And an economist would say, the article was kind of like, oh, this is tough, these rich folks moving in and changing everything. And an economist would say, well, you know what? You got outbid. Someone values this more than you do. It's more complicated than that, but we have no problems as economists with environmentalists buying the right to pollute, right? It's perfect in some sense, right? Because now everybody is sort of arguing on the same scale. Okay, let's see here. I think I have one more for you. So this is an important an idea that I hope you'll carry around. And I think in general, oftentimes a lot of these problems are just, not just in environmental economics, mind you, but everywhere. There's all kinds of problems caused by missing ownership and poorly defined property rights, right? So another great example, which is, I guess, maybe more explicitly environmental as well, is, if you go into these, the fisheries of the world, and the one that I have in mind here is the halibut fishery, I think, in Alaska. So they had they have interesting externality problems. And one of the solutions that, so here's what happens. Every year in Alaska, they've decided that they need a limit on the number of halibut, say, that are caught, right? Otherwise, the population crashes and it's no good for anyone. So they have, the environmental organizations do some research, they decide on what the catch should be, and then they say, this is the catch. And the way it used to work, right, is what would then happen is people would, they would say, well, the season's open until we hit the catch limit and then it's closed. So you can imagine how a fisherman might react to this, right? What do you have to do while the season is still open? You have to get out there, right? It's your livelihood. So fishermen were out there competing, and whatever the weather, whatever the conditions, you have to get out there and fish. Obviously very dangerous, right? There's even television shows about it, right? It's that dangerous. So economists said, well, this is inefficient, right? You'd like it if people could only fish when the conditions were good, and you'd like it if people weren't competing in that particular way. So they said, well, what we need here is we need better property rights. And in this case, the rights are shares of the catch. So you have your fishing industry, and then you say, all right, well, this industry gets, this person gets this share of the catch, that person gets that share of the catch, and this gives you the right to catch a certain amount of whatever the catch is, a certain percentage of it. So now you have this right, and you don't have to go out there and catch your fish right up until the limit is hit. Of course, you can also sell it if you have this right, and you're a traditional fisherman. You can take your right and you can sell it to someone else who wants it, right? Maybe if you're injured or whatever, or if someone's just more efficient at fishing than you, that's fine too. Of course, if you're an environmental organization, or if you care about the health of the ocean, you can buy as many shares as you want as well. I don't know if that's happened in this instance. So this is another interesting application of this idea. So I'll leave it at that. I know it was kind of a lot of stuff. A lot of crazy things happened today. As you're leaving, we got to hand out these practice exams, right? And we'll do a full review for our exam 1 week from today.